October 28, 1962, 14:45 hours Eastern Time, Pentagon Naval Intelligence Division, Washington, D.C. Commander William B. Ecker reviewed the preliminary after-action report from Task Group 81.2, the Navy anti-submarine warfare units that had been prosecuting Soviet submarines in the Caribbean during the previous week's crisis. The report contained routine details, contact times, tracking procedures, weapon deployment protocols. But one section, buried on page 47, made Ecker stop reading and reread the paragraph 3 times. October 27, 15:30 hours, USS Beale, USS Coney, USS Murray, prosecuted unknown submerged contact designated Sierra 2 using practice depth charges per standing orders. Contact surfaced at 15:39 hours, identified as Soviet Foxtrot-class submarine. Visual observation noted unusual crew behavior. Multiple personnel on deck appeared agitated. Several officers engaged in animated discussion on conning tower. Submarine remained surfaced for 47 minutes before diving and departing area at high speed. Assessment: Soviet submarine experienced mechanical difficulties requiring emergency surface. Ecker had been monitoring Soviet submarine activity throughout the crisis. He knew that 4 Foxtrot-class submarines had been deployed to the Caribbean, designated by NATO as B-4, B-36, B-59, and B-130. He knew that U.S. Navy forces had been ordered to locate and track these submarines using practice depth charges, small explosive charges designed to signal, "We know you're there," without causing damage. What Ecker didn't know, what the contact report couldn't tell him, what wouldn't be revealed for decades, was that the submarine his forces had depth-charged on October 27th was B-59, commanded by Captain Valentin Savitsky. That the depth charging had occurred while the submarine was running submerged in tropical waters with failing air conditioning, with carbon dioxide levels approaching fatal concentrations, with the crew near mutiny from heat exhaustion and oxygen deprivation. That Captain Savitsky, believing war had begun and that his submarine was under attack with intent to destroy, had ordered preparation to launch the submarine's special weapon, a 10-kiloton nuclear torpedo designated T5, that the political officer aboard, Ivan Maslenikov, had agreed with the captain's assessment and supported launch authorization, and that the second-in-command flotilla commander, Vasily Arkhipov, had refused to concur. That Soviet Navy regulations required unanimous agreement from all 3 senior officers aboard to launch nuclear weapons. That Arkhipov's refusal had prevented the launch. That his no vote, given while the submarine was being depth-charged, while the captain was screaming that they would die but sink them all, had prevented a nuclear torpedo from detonating among American destroyers, enforcing the Cuban blockade. Commander Ecker, reading the contact report, saw only that a Soviet submarine had surfaced after depth charging. He didn't know that in those 47 minutes the submarine remained on the surface, 3 Soviet officers had been in a compartment settling an argument about whether to start World War III. He didn't know that one man's refusal to authorize launch had prevented a nuclear detonation that would have killed thousands of American sailors and almost certainly triggered nuclear war between the United States and Soviet Union. The report noted unusual crew behavior and animated discussion. That was the extent of what American intelligence could observe. What they couldn't observe was that Vasily Arkhipov, a Soviet submarine officer who had survived the K-19 reactor accident the previous year, who understood that hasty decisions in crisis conditions could be catastrophic, had stood in an overheated submarine compartment being depth-charged by American destroyers and told his captain, "No, we will not launch." October 28, 1962, was the day after the Cuban Missile Crisis had been resolved by diplomatic agreement. Commander Ecker was reviewing reports from operations that were now, thankfully, concluded without war. He had no way of knowing that the report he was reading documented the closest approach to nuclear war in human history, closer even than the missile crisis itself, because this approach involved not political leaders negotiating in rooms, but exhausted men in a dying submarine, making life or death decisions in minutes. The submarine officer refused the captain's order to launch a nuclear torpedo at U.S. destroyers during the Cuban crisis. His name was Vasily Arkhipov. His decision saved the world, and for decades, almost no one knew it had happened. To understand how a Soviet submarine officer's refusal to authorize a nuclear weapon launch prevented World War III, one must understand the Cuban Missile Crisis, the deployment of Soviet submarines to the Caribbean, and the specific circumstances aboard B-59 on October 27, 1962, that brought 3 men to the decision point of whether to use nuclear weapons. The Cuban Missile Crisis began on October 16, 1962, when President John F. Kennedy was informed that U-2 reconnaissance flights over Cuba had discovered Soviet ballistic missile sites under construction. The missiles, once operational, would be capable of striking most of the United States with nuclear warheads, providing only minutes of warning compared to the 30 minutes available for ICBMs launched from the Soviet Union. Kennedy convened the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, known as EXCOM, to debate response options. The options ranged from diplomatic protest to airstrikes destroying the missile sites to full invasion of Cuba. After days of debate, Kennedy chose a middle course: naval blockade of Cuba, termed a quarantine, to avoid the legal implications of blockade as an act of war. On October 22nd, Kennedy addressed the American public, announcing the discovery of Soviet missiles in Cuba and the implementation of the quarantine. He stated that any missile launched from Cuba would be regarded as a Soviet attack, requiring full retaliatory response. The speech put the world on notice that nuclear war was possible if the crisis escalated. On October 23rd, the quarantine went into effect. U.S. Navy ships established a perimeter around Cuba, with orders to stop and search all vessels approaching the island. Soviet ships approaching the quarantine line were ordered to turn back or be stopped by force. The world focused on the quarantine line, on whether Soviet ships would turn back or attempt to run the blockade, on whether American ships would fire on Soviet vessels. But while attention was on surface ships, another Soviet naval deployment was proceeding beneath the surface, largely unknown to the American public and imperfectly understood by American intelligence. In late September 1962, before the missile crisis began, the Soviet Navy had deployed 4 Foxtrot-class diesel-electric submarines to the Caribbean as part of Operation Karma. The mission was to establish a submarine presence near Cuba that could threaten American naval operations and support the Soviet military buildup on the island. The 4 submarines were B-4, B-36, B-59 and B-130, each commanded by experienced captains and carrying crews of approximately 78 men. The submarines were diesel-electric boats, not nuclear-powered, meaning they had to surface regularly to run diesel engines that recharged batteries and refreshed air supplies. Submerged endurance was limited to several days at most before surfacing became necessary. The Foxtrot class was designed for operations in cold northern waters. The submarines had minimal air conditioning, adequate for Arctic conditions, but insufficient for tropical waters. Extended submerged operations in the Caribbean would subject crews to temperatures exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit, with humidity near 100%, creating conditions that would rapidly exhaust crews and degrade operational capability. Each submarine carried standard torpedoes for anti-ship warfare, but each submarine also carried something the Americans didn't know about: one nuclear torpedo, designated T5, with a 10-kiloton yield. The nuclear torpedoes were intended for use against American aircraft carrier groups, providing the submarines with capability to destroy high-value targets that conventional torpedoes might not reach. The authorization procedures for the nuclear torpedoes were different from Soviet strategic nuclear weapons. ICBMs required authorization from Moscow, from the General Secretary himself. But the submarine nuclear torpedoes, operating in conditions where communication with Moscow might be impossible, had pre-delegated launch authority to the submarine commanders. Soviet Navy regulations required unanimous agreement from the 3 senior officers aboard each submarine: the captain, the political officer, and the flotilla commander, who served as second in command. This unusual command structure, with 3 officers required to agree on nuclear weapon use, existed only on these 4 submarines. It was implemented because the flotilla commander, Vasily Arkhipov, was the deputy commander of the entire submarine flotilla and had been assigned to travel aboard B-59 for this mission. His presence created the requirement for 3-person authorization. On the other submarines, only 2 officers' agreement was required: captain and political officer. The 4 submarines departed the Kola Peninsula in early October 1962, before the missile crisis began. They traveled independently, submerged during daylight hours, and surfaced at night to recharge batteries and ventilate the boats. The journey to the Caribbean required approximately 2 weeks, with the submarines scheduled to arrive in Cuban waters in late October. On October 23rd, as the quarantine went into effect, the 4 submarines were in mid-Atlantic, approaching the Caribbean. They received radio messages from Soviet Naval Command, informing them of the crisis and directing them to continue toward Cuba, but to avoid detection by American forces. The submarines were to operate submerged as much as possible, monitoring American naval activity, but not engaging unless attacked. The submarine captains understood that the crisis increased the danger of their mission significantly. American anti-submarine warfare forces would be actively searching for Soviet submarines. If detected, the submarines could expect to be tracked and possibly attacked. But the orders were clear: proceed to assigned patrol areas, remain undetected if possible, and complete the mission. What the submarine commanders didn't receive, what Soviet Naval Command failed to transmit clearly, was information about the rules of engagement the Americans were using. U.S. Navy forces had been ordered to use practice depth charges to signal detected submarines to surface. The practice depth charges were small, designed to make noise and indicate "we know you're there" without inflicting damage. But to a submarine captain deep underwater with no information about American procedures, practice depth charges and real depth charges sounded identical. Explosions nearby, indicating attack with intent to destroy. This communication failure would prove critical on October 27th, when B-59 encountered American destroyers. Submarine B-59 was commanded by Captain Second Rank Valentin Grigorievich Savitsky, a 45-year-old career submarine officer with extensive experience in Arctic operations. Savitsky was known as a competent but aggressive commander, someone who would execute orders forcefully and who expected immediate compliance from his crew. The political officer aboard B-59 was Ivan Simonovich Maslenikov, responsible for crew political education and morale. The political officer's role in Soviet military units was to ensure loyalty to Communist Party directives and to provide oversight of command decisions from a political perspective. On nuclear-capable submarines, the political officer's concurrence was required for launch authorization, providing political control over military decisions. The second in command was Captain Second Rank Vasily Alexandrovich Arkhipov, the deputy commander of the entire submarine flotilla. Arkhipov was 36 years old, younger than Savitsky, but more experienced in crisis management due to an incident the previous year. In July 1961, Arkhipov had served as executive officer aboard the submarine K-19, a nuclear-powered boat on patrol in the North Atlantic. K-19 suffered a catastrophic failure of its reactor cooling system, creating conditions where reactor meltdown was imminent. The captain and Arkhipov had organized the crew to improvise emergency cooling, requiring men to enter spaces with lethal radiation levels to prevent meltdown. The reactor was brought under control, preventing an explosion that would have destroyed the submarine and possibly triggered war if the Americans detected the reactor detonation and misidentified it as a nuclear weapon. Arkhipov had been exposed to significant radiation during the K-19 incident. 8 crewmen died from radiation exposure within days. Arkhipov survived, but knew the long-term health consequences would be severe. The experience had taught him that hasty decisions in crisis conditions could be catastrophic, that maintaining calm and considering alternatives was essential even under extreme pressure. This experience would inform Arkhipov's decision-making aboard B-59 15 months later. On October 25th, B-59 entered the Caribbean, approaching the quarantine zone established by U.S. Navy forces. The submarine was running submerged during daylight hours, surfacing only at night. The tropical waters were significantly warmer than the Arctic conditions for which the Foxtrot class had been designed. Even submerged, water temperature exceeded 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the submarine, temperatures reached 95 degrees. The submarine's air conditioning system, minimal even in ideal conditions, was overwhelmed by tropical heat. The crew, accustomed to Arctic operations, suffered from heat exhaustion. The submarine's battery-powered fans, used while submerged to circulate air, provided insufficient cooling. Men stripped to minimal clothing. Work in the engine room became nearly unbearable, with temperatures exceeding 110 degrees. On October 26th, B-59 detected heavy American anti-submarine warfare activity. Sonar contacts indicated multiple destroyers operating in patterns consistent with submarine search operations. Captain Savitsky ordered the submarine to remain submerged, avoiding detection. The submarine spent the entire day submerged, running at slow speed to conserve battery power and minimize noise. By evening, October 26th, conditions aboard B-59 had deteriorated significantly. The submarine had been submerged for over 24 hours. The batteries were depleted to 20% charge. Carbon dioxide levels were rising as the air purification system struggled to keep up with 78 men breathing in a sealed hull. Several crew members were showing symptoms of carbon dioxide poisoning: headaches, dizziness, difficulty concentrating. Savitsky needed to surface to recharge batteries and ventilate the boat, but American ASW forces were still operating nearby. Surfacing would reveal the submarine's position and likely result in being forced to leave the area, failing the mission. Savitsky decided to remain submerged through the night, conserving power and hoping American forces would move on. October 27, 1962, dawned as the most dangerous day of the Cuban Missile Crisis. In Cuba, Soviet forces shot down an American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft, killing the pilot. In Washington, ExComm debated whether to respond with airstrikes against Cuban air defense sites, which would likely escalate to full invasion. In Moscow, Soviet leadership considered options if the United States invaded Cuba, including use of tactical nuclear weapons to defend the island. Neither American nor Soviet leadership knew that 300 miles north of Cuba, aboard submarine B-59, conditions were approaching a crisis point that would bring nuclear war closer than any of the political decisions being made in capitals. By 1,000 hours on October 27th, B-59 had been submerged continuously for 40 hours. Battery charge was at 12%, approaching the minimum level required to maintain life support systems. Carbon dioxide levels exceeded safety limits. The temperature inside the submarine was 105 degrees. Several crew members had collapsed from heat exhaustion. The submarine's doctor reported that men were experiencing symptoms of severe heat stress and carbon dioxide poisoning. Captain Savitsky faced an impossible situation. If he surfaced during daylight, the submarine would be detected and forced to surface fully, revealing Soviet submarine presence to the Americans. But if he remained submerged much longer, the crew would become incapable of operating the submarine, and battery depletion would force an emergency surface anyway. At 1100 hours, Savitsky ordered the submarine to proceed toward Cuba at slow speed, conserving battery power while covering distance toward the mission area. If American forces didn't detect them, they could surface after dark, recharge and continue operations. If detected, they would surface under duress, but would have attempted to complete the approach. At 12:15 hours, B-59's sonar operator reported propeller contacts, multiple high-speed contacts on converging courses, American destroyers actively searching with sonar. The submarine had been detected. The contacts were USS Beale, USS Coney, and USS Murray, destroyers from Task Group 81. 2. Assigned to anti-submarine warfare operations around the quarantine zone. The destroyers had detected B-59 using dipping sonar from helicopters and were moving to prosecute the contact. At 12:30 hours, the first explosion occurred. The sound inside B-59 was catastrophic, a massive detonation, close enough to shake the entire submarine, loud enough to be painful to crew members not wearing hearing protection. Then another explosion, and another. The destroyers were dropping depth charges. To the American destroyer crews, these were practice depth charges, small explosive devices designed to signal surface immediately without causing damage. The practice depth charges contained approximately 5 pounds of explosive, enough to make noise, but not enough to damage a submarine hull unless detonated in direct contact. To the crew of B-59, the explosions were indistinguishable from combat depth charging. The submarine was 150 feet below the surface. The explosions sounded like they were detonating directly above the hull. Each explosion was accompanied by the submarine hull groaning and flexing from the pressure waves. Men were thrown to the deck, lights flickered, equipment shook loose from mountings. In the control room, Captain Savitsky demanded assessment. Are we holed? Do we have flooding? The damage control officer reported, no flooding detected, hull integrity maintained, but the explosions are close, Captain. They're trying to kill us. More explosions. The depth charging continued for 20 minutes, with charges detonating every 2 to 3 minutes. 25 explosions total, each one shaking the submarine, each one suggesting to the crew that their boat was under attack with intent to destroy. At 12:50 hours, the depth charging paused. The American destroyers were repositioning, establishing a triangle pattern around the submarine's position. If B-59 attempted to escape in any direction, at least one destroyer would detect the movement and resume depth charging. Inside B-59, Captain Savitsky convened an emergency command conference in the control room. Present were Savitsky, political officer Maslenikov, and flotilla commander Arkhipov. The three men who, under Soviet Navy regulations, would have to unanimously agree if nuclear weapons were to be used. Savitsky spoke first. Comrades, we are under attack. The Americans are trying to sink us. They are using depth charges. We've been submerged for 2 days. The crew is exhausted. Carbon dioxide is at dangerous levels. We cannot survive much longer submerged. If we attempt to surface, they will capture us. If we remain submerged, we will suffocate. We have one option to break free: use the special weapon. The special weapon, the T-5 nuclear torpedo, 10 kilotons, capable of destroying all 3 destroyers with a single detonation. Maslenikov, the political officer, responded, "Captain Savitsky is correct. We are under attack. Obviously, war has started. Moscow has not communicated with us because war conditions make communication impossible. The Americans are trying to destroy us before we can strike their carrier groups. Our duty is to use all weapons at our disposal to complete our mission. I concur with using the special weapon." Soviet Navy regulations required unanimous agreement from all 3 senior officers. Savitsky and Maslenikov had voted yes. The decision now rested with Arkhipov. The control room waited. The submarine was still being tracked by American sonar. The destroyers could resume depth charging at any moment. The temperature was 105 degrees. Carbon dioxide levels were causing several crew members to lose consciousness. Every minute of delay increased the risk that the crew would become incapable of executing any decision. Vasily Arkhipov, standing in that overheated control room, faced the most consequential decision any military officer has ever faced. If he concurred, the submarine would launch a nuclear torpedo at American destroyers. The torpedo would detonate among the American ships, killing thousands of sailors. The United States, having lost multiple destroyers to nuclear attack during a crisis where tensions were already at maximum, would almost certainly respond with nuclear strikes against Soviet forces in Cuba and possibly the Soviet Union itself. World War III would begin not from a decision in Washington or Moscow, but from a decision made by 3 exhausted men in a submarine that had been depth-charged into believing war had already started. Arkhipov had seconds to decide. The captain was screaming for his answer. The political officer had already concurred. The crew was looking at him, waiting to see if they would fire the weapon that would start the war. Arkhipov remembered K-19. He remembered the reactor crisis. He remembered how hasty decisions in emergency conditions could make situations worse. He remembered that when you're inside a crisis, your perception of the situation is often wrong. You need to step back, consider alternatives, question assumptions. Were they really under attack? If the Americans wanted to destroy the submarine, they would use heavier weapons, not these relatively small explosions. The explosions were consistent with signaling charges, meant to force surfacing, not destruction. Had war really started? If Moscow had ordered nuclear release, they would have communicated that order before communications were disrupted. The absence of orders suggested war had not started, that this was still a crisis situation requiring careful management, not immediate escalation. Was launching the nuclear torpedo the only option? No. They could surface. Yes, it would be humiliating. Yes, the Americans would force them to leave the area, but surfacing would save the crew, would avoid using nuclear weapons in a situation where the necessity was unclear. Arkhipov made his decision. He looked at Captain Savitsky and said, "No. I do not concur. We will not launch the special weapon. We will surface and assess the situation. If the Americans continue to attack after we surface, we can reconsider. But we will not start a nuclear war based on an assumption that war has already begun when we have no confirmation." Captain Savitsky exploded in rage. "You're refusing to fight. The Americans are killing us and you want to surrender. We'll die, but we'll sink them all. We'll die, but we'll sink them all. I order you to concur." Arkhipov held his ground. "Captain, I respect your assessment, but I do not believe war has started. I believe these are signaling charges meant to force us to surface. Soviet Navy regulations require unanimous agreement for nuclear weapon use. I do not concur. We will surface." Maslenikov, the political officer, attempted to support Savitsky. "Comrade Arkhipov, the captain is correct. Our duty requires using all available weapons." But Arkhipov was senior to Maslenikov in the command hierarchy. As flotilla commander, Arkhipov technically outranked the submarine captain in some contexts. The command structure was ambiguous enough that if Arkhipov refused to concur, there was no mechanism to override his refusal. Savitsky, realizing that Arkhipov would not change his position, made the decision to surface. He ordered the crew to bring the submarine to the surface and prepare to confront the American destroyers. At 15:39 hours on October 27, 1962, submarine B-59 surfaced in the Caribbean Sea, surrounded by 3 American destroyers. The submarine's crew, many shirtless and showing signs of severe heat exhaustion, climbed onto the deck to breathe fresh air. On the conning tower, Captain Savitsky, political officer Maslenikov, and flotilla commander Arkhipov stood watching the American ships, knowing they had just made a decision that might have prevented war, but had certainly ended their careers. The American destroyers, seeing the Soviet submarine surface, ceased depth charging and moved to visual observation range. The submarine remained surfaced for 47 minutes, recharging batteries and ventilating the hull. The Americans made no attempt to board or capture the submarine. After sufficient time to recover minimal operational capability, B-59 dove and departed the area at high speed, heading away from Cuba. The incident was over. 3 American destroyers had forced a Soviet submarine to surface. To the Americans, this was a successful ASW operation. To the Soviets, it was a humiliating failure, but not a catastrophic incident. What neither side knew was that for approximately 20 minutes in that control room, the decision to use nuclear weapons had hung on one man's refusal to concur. If Arkhipov had voted yes, if the launch authorization had been unanimous, B-59 would have fired its nuclear torpedo at the American destroyers, and the world would have changed in the flash of a 10-kiloton detonation. The timeline of what would have occurred if Arkhipov had concurred and the nuclear torpedo had been launched can be constructed from nuclear weapons effects data and analysis of likely American response to nuclear attack during the Cuban Missile Crisis. October 27, 1962, 1300 hours. Hypothetical. Vasily Arkhipov concurs with Captain Savitsky's recommendation to launch the T-5 nuclear torpedo. The 3 officers' unanimous agreement provides launch authorization under Soviet Navy regulations. 1302 hours. Torpedo crew loads the T-5 into tube number 1. The weapon is armed. Safety systems are disabled. Launch sequence begins. 1305 hours. B-59 maneuvers to bring the torpedo tube to bear on the American destroyer group. Target is USS Beale, the closest destroyer. Range 3,000 yards. The T-5 is set for proximity detonation at 500 yards from target. 1307 hours. Captain Savitsky orders, fire tube 1. The torpedo launches. The T-5 exits the tube and begins its run toward the American destroyers. 1308 hours. USS Beale's sonar detects the torpedo launch. The destroyer's Combat Information Center identifies the torpedo as hostile and classifies it as a conventional weapon based on acoustic signature. No American intelligence suggests Soviet submarines carry nuclear torpedoes. The expectation is this is a standard Soviet torpedo, dangerous but not world-ending. USS Beale initiates evasive maneuvers and launches countermeasures. The destroyer turns hard to starboard, attempting to present the smallest target profile. The ship's anti-submarine rockets are readied to fire at the submarine. 1309 hours, 30 seconds. The T-5 torpedo reaches proximity fusing range, 500 yards from USS Beale. The torpedo's fusing system activates. The 10-kiloton nuclear warhead detonates. The fireball, although underwater, creates a massive pressure wave and cavitation bubble that rises to the surface. USS Beale, at 3,000 yards from detonation point, is within the severe damage radius. The destroyer's hull is crushed by the pressure wave. The ship breaks in half and sinks within 90 seconds. Casualties, 100% of the 250-man crew. USS Coney and USS Murray, at 4,000 and 5,000 yards respectively, are within the significant damage radius. Both destroyers suffer major structural damage. Hull plates are torn loose. Superstructures collapse. Both ships are crippled and beginning to sink. Combined casualties, approximately 300 of 500 crew members. The nuclear detonation creates a massive radioactive water plume that contaminates all three ships and will spread across miles of ocean. Surviving crew members receive lethal radiation doses, 1,310 hours. At the Pentagon, the National Military Command Center receives flash traffic from Task Group 81.2, multiple units under attack. Large underwater explosion. USS Beale sunk, USS Coney and USS Murray severely damaged and sinking. Nature of explosion unknown, possibly mine or torpedo. Within minutes, additional reports clarify. Explosion characteristics consistent with nuclear detonation. Estimate yield 10 to 20 kilotons. Radioactive contamination detected. 1,312 hours. President Kennedy is notified that 3 American destroyers have been attacked with a nuclear weapon in the Caribbean during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Casualties exceed 500 American sailors. The attack occurred in international waters during enforcement of the quarantine. Kennedy convenes emergency session of ExComm. The critical question: was this attack authorized by Soviet leadership, or was it an unauthorized action by a submarine commander? Either interpretation leads to war. If authorized, the Soviet Union has launched nuclear attack against American forces. This constitutes an act of war requiring immediate retaliation. If unauthorized, Soviet command and control over nuclear weapons is so compromised that local commanders are using nuclear weapons without authorization. This suggests Soviet forces might launch additional attacks without Moscow's approval, requiring American military action to destroy Soviet capabilities before more attacks occur. 1,320 hours. ExComm assesses options. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara recommends immediate airstrikes against Soviet forces in Cuba, including nuclear sites, followed by full invasion. The U.S. military has been planning for this contingency. Forces are ready. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Maxwell Taylor recommends broader retaliation, not only strikes against Cuba, but also strikes against Soviet submarines worldwide and possibly Soviet naval bases. If the Soviets have used nuclear weapons once, they might do so again. American forces must eliminate the threat. 1,330 hours. Kennedy makes the decision. He authorizes airstrikes against Soviet military targets in Cuba, including nuclear missile sites and the IL-28 bomber bases. He orders U.S. Navy forces to attack all Soviet submarines in the Atlantic and Caribbean, using full combat measures, including nuclear depth charges. He places Strategic Air Command on maximum alert and authorizes limited nuclear release for tactical situations. 1,345 hours. American aircraft launch from Florida toward Cuba. Targets include the Soviet missile sites at San Cristobal and Sagua La Grande, IL-28 bomber bases, and Soviet military installations. Approximately 200 aircraft participate in the first strike. 1,347 hours. In Moscow, Soviet air defense radar detects the American aircraft approaching Cuba. Soviet leadership, already under extreme tension due to the crisis, receives reports of massive American air attack on Soviet forces in Cuba. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev convenes emergency presidium meeting. The report of American attack follows the sinking of American destroyers by Soviet submarine nuclear torpedo. To Soviet leadership, this sequence suggests American retaliation for the torpedo attack, but Soviet leadership never authorized the torpedo attack. Many Presidium members don't know it occurred. The confusion is profound. The Americans are attacking, apparently in retaliation for something the Soviet Union didn't know happened. Is this American first strike using the crisis as pretext, or retaliation for the submarine attack? 1400 hours, American aircraft strike Soviet targets in Cuba. The missile sites are destroyed. The bomber bases are destroyed. Soviet casualties exceed 2,000. Cuban casualties exceed 5,000. Soviet forces in Cuba, including the tactical nuclear weapons deployed but not fully assembled, are destroyed or damaged. Some Soviet officers, seeing American attack and believing war has begun, attempt to activate tactical nuclear weapons. Some succeed. 1420 hours, Soviet tactical nuclear weapon detonates at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. The weapon, a short-range missile with 12-kiloton warhead, was fired at the American naval base by Soviet forces believing they were under attack as part of invasion. The base is destroyed. Casualties exceed 4,000 American military personnel. 14 to 25 hours. Kennedy receives report of nuclear detonation at Guantanamo. This is the second Soviet nuclear attack within 2 hours. Kennedy orders full retaliation. Strategic Air Command receives launch orders. Approximately 100 B-52 bombers that have been on airborne alert proceed to Soviet targets. Minuteman ICBM crews receive launch orders. The execution of the single integrated operational plan begins. 1430 hours. In Moscow, Soviet early warning systems detect American bomber movements and ICBM launches. Soviet leadership concludes that full American nuclear attack is underway. Khrushchev, despite his preference for negotiation, recognizes that Soviet retaliation must occur immediately, or Soviet forces will be destroyed before they can launch. Soviet strategic rocket forces receive launch orders. Approximately 200 Soviet ICBMs begin launching from sites across the Soviet Union. 1500 hours. Nuclear war is fully engaged. American and Soviet strategic forces are launching. Within 30 minutes, the first ICBMs will impact targets. Within hours, approximately 2,000 nuclear weapons will detonate across North America, Europe, and the Soviet Union. October 28, 1962. Approximately 100 million people are dead. Major cities in the United States, Soviet Union, and Europe have been destroyed. Command and control systems are largely destroyed. Neither side has effective central government remaining. November 1962. Nuclear winter begins as smoke from burning cities rises into the stratosphere. Global temperatures drop. Agriculture collapses. Mass starvation begins. 1963. Total casualties exceed 500 million. Human civilization has experienced collapse comparable to the fall of Rome, but occurring in weeks rather than centuries, and global in scope rather than regional. This timeline would have been triggered by 3 exhausted men in an overheated submarine making the decision to use a nuclear weapon because they believed they were under attack and that war had already begun. Vasily Arkhipov's no vote prevented this timeline. His refusal to concur saved approximately 500 million lives and preserved human civilization. The actual outcome of the B-59 incident was that the submarine surfaced, recovered minimal operational capability, and departed the area. The submarine returned to the Soviet Union in November 1962. Captain Savitsky faced an investigation into the incident, but was not court-martialed. Soviet Navy leadership concluded that Savitsky had acted within his authority given the circumstances, but that the decision to surface rather than use the nuclear torpedo was correct. Vasily Arkhipov received no commendation for preventing nuclear war. His role in the incident was classified. The Soviet government never publicly acknowledged that nuclear-armed submarines had been deployed to the Caribbean during the crisis. Arkhipov continued his naval career, eventually reaching the rank of vice admiral and commanding the Soviet Navy's submarine flotilla. Arkhipov's health, compromised by radiation exposure during the K-19 incident, deteriorated through the 1970s and 1980s. He developed kidney cancer, likely caused by the radiation exposure. He died in 1998 at age 72. His obituary in Russian naval publications mentioned his distinguished service, but did not mention the B-59 incident or his role in preventing nuclear war. The full story of what happened aboard B-59 on October 27, 1962, was not revealed until 2002 at a conference commemorating the 40th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Participants included American and Soviet veterans of the crisis, including submarine officers who had served aboard the Foxtrot submarines. At the conference, the former officers described the conditions aboard their submarines during the crisis. They described the depth charging, the debates about using nuclear weapons, and Arkhipov's refusal to concur with launch authorization. For the first time, American officials understood how close they had come to nuclear war from a source they hadn't even known existed. Submarines they had been depth charging with practice charges that the submarines had interpreted as combat attacks. Thomas Blanton, director of the National Security Archive, which had organized the conference, stated, "A guy called Vasily Arkhipov saved the world." The statement, while dramatic, was supported by the evidence. If Arkhipov had concurred with launch authorization, nuclear war was highly likely. His refusal prevented the launch and therefore prevented the escalation that would have followed. The historical significance of the B-59 incident was gradually recognized over subsequent years. In 2017, on what would have been Arkhipov's 90th birthday, the Future of Life Institute awarded him a posthumous prize for his role in preventing nuclear war. His widow, Olga Arkhipova, accepted the award. The broader lessons of the B-59 incident extended beyond celebrating one man's decision to the recognition that nuclear weapons in crisis situations, under the control of local commanders, operating with imperfect information and under extreme stress, created unacceptable risks of unauthorized or mistaken use. The United States and Soviet Union implemented several changes following the Cuban Missile Crisis, informed by the B-59 incident once it was understood. First, improved communication between national leaders. The hotline between Washington and Moscow was established in 1963 specifically to enable rapid communication during crises, reducing the risk that misunderstandings or lack of information would lead to escalation. Second, more restrictive control over nuclear weapons at sea. The pre-delegated launch authority that had allowed submarine commanders to use nuclear weapons without consulting Moscow was reconsidered. While submarines required some autonomy due to communication difficulties, the procedures were tightened to reduce risk of unauthorized or mistaken launch. Third, improved signaling during submarine tracking operations. The U.S. Navy developed clearer protocols for indicating to detected submarines that tracking operations were non-hostile. This included establishing communication procedures and using specific sonar signals to indicate surface immediately in ways less ambiguous than depth charging. Fourth, restrictions on nuclear weapons deployment during crises. The deployment of nuclear-armed submarines to crisis areas was recognized as creating excessive risk. Future crises would be managed with conventional forces where possible, reserving nuclear forces for strategic deterrence rather than tactical operations. The statistics of what was prevented by Vasily Arkhipov's decision on October 27, 1962, quantify the margin by which human civilization survived. B-59 Incident Summary. Date, October 27, 1962. Location, Caribbean Sea, 300 miles north of Cuba. Submarine, B-59, Soviet Foxtrot-class diesel-electric submarine crew, 78 officers and men. Weapon, 1 T-5 nuclear torpedo, 10 kiloton yield conditions, 40-plus hours submerged. Temperature 105 degrees Celsius. Carbon dioxide at dangerous levels. Attack 3 American destroyers using practice charges. Command decision. Captain Savitsky and political officer Maslenikov voted to launch nuclear torpedo. Arkhipov decision. Refused to concur, preventing launch outcome. Submarine surfaced. Departed area. Return to Soviet Union casualties. 0 time from launch authorization debate to surface. Approximately 30 minutes if nuclear torpedo had been launched. American ships destroyed. 3 destroyers. USS Beale, USS Coney, USS Murray. American casualties. 650 sailors. American response time. 10 to 15 minutes American retaliation. Air strikes on Cuba. Attack on Soviet submarines worldwide. Soviet counter-retaliation. Tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba. Strategic forces launch. Total nuclear weapons detonated. Approximately 2,000 to 3,000 immediate casualties, 100 to 150 million first-year casualties, 500 million to 1 billion long-term effects, nuclear winter, agricultural collapse, civilization collapse. Cost of Arkhipov's decision, possible career damage. Certain criticism from superiors. Benefit of Arkhipov's decision. Prevention of nuclear war, survival of human civilization, margin of survival, 1 man's vote in a 3-person authorization system. On October 27, 1962, at approximately 1300 hours, Soviet submarine B-59 was being depth-charged by American destroyers in the Caribbean Sea. The submarine had been submerged for more than 40 hours in tropical waters. The crew was exhausted, suffering from heat stress and carbon dioxide poisoning. Captain Savitsky believed war had begun and that his submarine was under attack with intent to destroy. Savitsky ordered preparation to launch the submarine's nuclear torpedo at the American destroyers. Political officer Maslenikov concurred. Soviet Navy regulations required unanimous agreement from all 3 senior officers aboard. The decision fell to flotilla commander Vasily Arkhipov. Arkhipov refused. He assessed that war had not begun, that the depth charges were signaling devices rather than combat attacks, and that launching a nuclear weapon based on incomplete information would be catastrophic. He ordered the submarine to surface instead. The submarine officer refused the captain's order to launch a nuclear torpedo at U.S. destroyers during the Cuban crisis. His name was Vasily Arkhipov. His decision, made in an overheated control room while being depth-charged, while the captain screamed that they would die but sink them all, while everything suggested that war had already begun, prevented the launch that would have killed thousands of American sailors and almost certainly triggered nuclear war between the United States and Soviet Union. For decades, almost no one knew this had happened. The incident was classified. Arkhipov received no recognition. He continued his career, his health slowly failing from radiation exposure at K-19. He died in 1998, largely unknown outside Soviet naval circles. In 2002, 40 years after the incident, the story was revealed. The world learned that on October 27, 1962, during the most dangerous day of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest approach to nuclear war had occurred not in Washington or Moscow, but in a Soviet submarine that had been depth-charged into believing war had started. And that 1 man's refusal to authorize nuclear weapon launch had prevented World War III. The Soviet submarine officer refused the captain's order to launch a nuclear torpedo at U.S. destroyers during the Cuban crisis. Vasily Arkhipov said no. And the world survived because in the moment when saying yes seemed reasonable, when the captain was screaming to fire, when the political officer had already concurred, when everything suggested war had begun, Arkhipov remembered that hasty decisions in crisis conditions could be catastrophic. He remembered K-19. He remembered that perception from inside a crisis is often wrong. And he voted no. One man, one vote, one decision. And approximately 500 million lives saved because Vasily Arkhipov, standing in an overheated submarine control room being depth-charged by American destroyers, had the clarity and courage to refuse.